Hello everyone, I'm Michael Pereira. I lead the DevOps architect at Northwestern Mutual, a large insurance company from Wisconsin. I am here to talk about a controversial topic. Did microservices kill CICD? Well, maybe not kill, but I need a catchy title to draw the crowd in, sorry. What we can definitely say though, is that microservices had a strong impact on CICD. But before we dive into it, a quick recap on the situation at hand. For those that may be lucky enough to have escaped it, they may not know that monoliths were the main type of applications before. There were no clouds, containers, Kubernetes, so creating a new application and deploying it was always a big endeavor. Instead, it was much easier to keep bloating existing ones. So usually, as you can see, there was a single big application and everyone worked on it. If you needed to create a new feature, you would either spend a lot of time trying to re-architect things around to add it cleanly, or just quickly add it to the pile of existing spaghetti code and be done with it. Somehow, one of those choices usually one when management was involved. In this world, all the code is directly interconnected. Different teams maintain different parts of the monolithic application, but no one person really understands the entirety of the application since it's so complex. And especially because the boundaries of the different domains aren't really clear. You can see that everything is kind of mixed together. Anyway, at some point, features are deemed ready and get integrated into the main code base. At this stage, it's now the job of the CICD pipeline, the one that makes or break releases to build a project. A lot of time is spent maintaining it. A lot of time is spent figuring out who broke the build or the test, since so many changes are integrated at once. It's difficult to integrate changes, so it's not done very frequently. By some miracle, someone manages to fix the build and the complex deployment process of the monolith begins. And after enough time spent wondering what went wrong in the 3,000 lines long deploy shell script, it ends up doing the job. Who knew this one environment variable was really needed? One day, an executive hears about microservices at an industry conference, maybe a previous edition of CICD, and finally gives the go-ahead to the development teams to start cutting the monoliths into a plethora of new microservices. After a few weeks, months, or years, we now have a collection of microservices replacing the monolith. And instead of one monorepo, we have a bunch of repos. But in a case I've encountered in the past, after all this work, somehow releases were now taking even longer to ship than with the monolith. So let's open the hood on a recreation of that real-world example to see what the team was dealing with. So our old monolith was cut down into 8 microservices. Not too bad, right? But when I asked the team to show me why it was so difficult to deploy, here's what they drew instead. Now I get why they recently hired a release manager and why QA had such a hard time to test anything, and I've been trying to advocate for code freezes, and so that's just so that they could catch up with the changes being made all the time. Each of those services had its own CI/CD pipeline, but none of those pipelines are really providing value because it's simply impossible to ship each piece individually. There's just too much risk of breaking something. So we need another encompassing pipeline to ship the whole thing driven from the top at the algo repo. And it was always a pain because it was a lot of time spent figuring out which version to ship when. The main issue here is that we've replaced the monoliths with a microlithic architecture. Or as was best said by Craig McLuckie, one of Kubernetes creators, a really gnarly coordination problem. In our case, versioning was introduced, I said that it helped, but it didn't really resolve the core issue. So now let's go back to the CI/CD part, and more specifically the CI part, the continuous integration. If we reference that this article from Martin Fowler that describes continuous integration, we see that the first principle is maintain a single source repository. It's quite simple, really. Keep related code in the same repository. Well, code that makes sense to go together. Otherwise, you can go crazy and can easily recreate a giant monorepo for the entire company, and that's probably not what you want to be doing. But it's a problem that I see quite frequently. We think about composability and decoupling services, and we forget that the repository boundary is not easy to overcome. Now, let's take maybe a simpler example. A modern website with a reactive UI on the side and a REST API on the other side. If the UI is the only client of that API, there isn't that much to gain by dividing the code base into two repositories. So keep your life simple, and instead of dividing your project into two repositories, just create two different subfolders in a single repository, each one with its own container, as you can see. I know that most people expect to find Docker files at the root of the repository, but if you move it down one level in a logical way, it doesn't really break much, and it's not unexpected. So now you can even make it even simpler to run the whole application if you just throw a Docker compose or kubernetes.yaml if you use makecube at the top of the repo. It can orchestrate all those containers together for an easier experience of local development. And doesn't necessarily mean that your UI should be not coded and that you can call the backend functions directly without going through the HTTP layer. So if you keep that, you ensure that your services are decomposed. But it shouldn't require you to synchronize several CICD pipelines together to be able to release a single change into production. Remember, if you can't deliver business value by making changes in a single repo, it may be time to revisit your repository architecture. It's not always easy to follow, for sure. A lot of people cannot leverage abstraction tools like Kubernetes to run the application, and they have to provision the underlying infrastructure onto which the application runs themselves. One of those tools is Terraform, and I've seen people try to mix complex Terraform code with their not so simple application or inside of a single pipeline. I think that the results kind of speak for themselves in this case. You can guess from the number of stages that it is quite the pipeline, and it is reflected in the overall pipeline time. More than 5 hours, sometimes up to 6. You can see why that pipeline was abandoned, because it would just take too long to make any change. At best, you can make a change in the morning, talk to people, send a few mails, have lunch, attend a few meetings, and by the time you're ready to see if your change from the morning worked. If it didn't, well, you can make one other change and go back home for the day, since you won't have the results until the next day. I'm sure there are ways to mix the application code and infrastructure code in a way that doesn't make your life miserable, but it's not an issue that's very specific to Terraform. I just wanted to show that the limits of that paradigm. Don't just put everything together. I would probably wait until there are better options for mixing, abstracting your infrastructure away from your application code, especially if you don't reuse environment. In the meantime, don't necessarily feel constrained to having only a single pipeline per repository. And again, build it in a way that makes sense for you to get feedback in a reasonable time. If you go back to our web app example, maybe you can only activate the front-end pipeline if only this part of what's changed and cut your pipeline time in half. Anyway, remember that if you're choosing to use microservices, you're creating independently deployable services around business domains and replacing your dependencies on method signatures or libraries with remote API calls over HTTP. So it can have some impact on the network. On the other hand, remember that you can recreate monoliths that make sense and stay measurable. If you have a small team, unclear domain, if you expect your service interface to change, if you don't need to scale each of those domain, and it can be just a simpler deployment topology. So microservices didn't kill CICD yet, but they kind of made it worse in some cases. So don't throw the monoliths away just now. You can start cutting it into microservices, but you can keep them into a monorepo. until you are ready, until you really need to decouple things even further. Thank you for your time, and happy continuous delivery.